Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So just to make sure that anyone that's parked here on campus definitely needs to have a parking permit. So in case you didn't have that, we have some extra parking permits, but you don't want to get a ticket because they're expensive now, more than $50. But then you come and complain to me, but I'm warning you now, so.
You can dish out 20 years ago, I paid $30.
$30.
I had parked in the wrong place at the lecture.
So you remember what it's like.
Oh, yeah.
I have to put my glasses on. So good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Armenian Studies program, I'd like to welcome you to our fall lecture series. As some of you have been to several of our lectures, we have a variety of lectures over the semester, but I want to tell you a little bit about what's upcoming in the next 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks, so that you can think about it. Next Thursday night, we're going to have Dr. Carol Bertram speaking, and she has written a book about her experiences traveling to historic Armenia, and she has gone several times with groups, and she has interviewed those people that have gone, and she's made the tie between Armenians who go back and the reasons why they go back to their ancestral places. That's kind of her area of expertise. She's from San Francisco State. She'll be speaking in our normal area, which is the University Business Center. Tonight, the center was busy, so we're here in this room. But she'll be speaking next Thursday, October the 20th at 7 p.m. And then the week following that, actually in the week and a half after that, on November the 1st, which is a Tuesday night, our Kazan visiting professor in Armenian Studies will be giving his third lecture in his 3-part series. Dr. Panosian is over there. Just raise your hand, everyone, and give him a round of applause. Dr. Panosian is here for the semester. He's a visiting professor. He's teaching a course, and he's also giving 3 public lectures. The first 2 lectures were about the Armenians in contemporary Turkey, and the last one was about the Muslim and Alevi Armenians, and his final talk will be about the new Armenian migrants from Armenia who are now working in Turkey. So it's going to be a very interesting topic because it's very contemporary. What do the Armenians who come from Armenia experience when they're working in Turkey? That will be on Tuesday, November the 1st at 7 p.m. All of our presentations are also online. We archive them on YouTube, so if you happen to know friends that want to see the lectures, you can always go on YouTube. So I'm Professor Bardizag, and again want to welcome you to our lecture. Tonight, our guest speakers are going to speak about the Soprano Zabelle Panosian, who was born in 1891 and died in 1986, and she's among the most significant voices of the genocide generation of Armenian-Americans. I'm not going to tell you more about her because that's what our speakers are here to tell you about, but also there's a very interesting part to her life, which is the Fresno connection. So she did have the opportunity to visit Fresno and sang and performed in Fresno. We'll hear about that tonight as well from our guest speakers. Our speakers tonight are Ian Nagoski. He's a music researcher and a record producer. He's coming from Baltimore, Maryland. For more than a decade, he's produced scores of reissues of early 20th century recordings in languages other than English for many labels, including Dust the Digital, Tompkins Square, and his own Canary Records. But he has also now done a lot of work with Armenian recording and music, and he'll tell you about that as well. Our second speaker will be tonight Harout Arakelian, who is a video editor, music collector, researcher based in Los Angeles, and his focus is on the Armenian contribution to the landscape of art and culture, with the specific lens on the American experience. And he's actively working on collecting every known commercial recording, that's what he says, from the 78 RPM era. So, ladies and gentlemen, tonight we'll be beginning with Ian Nagoski, who will be talking about Zabelle Panosian's life in general, followed by Harout Arakelian, who will be talking about the Fresno Armenian connection with Zabelle Panosian. After the presentation, we'll have an opportunity for some questions, so if you do have questions, you can raise your hand afterwards. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ian Nagoski. Ian?
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for all coming here. I really appreciate it.
Use the microphone, it's really...
Oh, I will. I'm just getting myself situated here. Okay, so hi. Thank you for having us so much. This has been so important to us for some years now. give you a little clue about me and who I am and why I'm here. For 25 years, I've just been digging around in old, dusty, crusty, musty 78 RPM records. And I made a rule for myself as a teenager, anything that's not in English, buy that. There's a lot of them, there's tons of them. That era, 1900 to 1960, yeah, America produced a huge number of recordings, and tons of them were in languages other than English laying around, where I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, Biden country. Yeah, and I didn't know what they were, you know, I only read and speak English. Very poor education, dropped out of high school when I was 16 with a D- in English. But I would just pick these up and I'd put the needle on them and I'd listen to them, and if they were good, that seemed to indicate that there was something I could learn there. And so all of my life, everything I know has come from records. There's a lot to learn from musicians. They're interesting people because they're a particular scale of people. They're not the richest and most powerful, generally. They may have known some of them. They're not the hardest working, poorest. They're somewhere floating in and out, various places, but they're dedicated to the expression of what's going on with themselves and their communities all the time. They're always learning and telling back the values of whatever's going on around them. So it makes them a really interesting window. And so you put the needle on the record, you hear somebody, and you think, okay, I like you. You're telling me the truth about something, don't know what. Now can I find out what it is you're trying to tell me? And the first thing you have to find out is, who are you? Where are you from? When were you born? When did you get married? What was it like being a parent? What did you have to do for money? What is your life really made of? Because these old records, you see, the way they're made is that when a person goes to the recording studio, they sit down and they record for 3 minutes, and when you listen back to the record, you get exactly that 3 minutes of that person's life. You live it back with them. So, just a little fragment of a human being. Oh. So, started listening to these records, and over time I began learning stories about some of the people who made them, and then I began making projects for myself. I'm going to learn connections and relationships. One of the things I decided to do about 15 years ago was look at all of the recordings made in the United States by people who spoke Greek, Turkish, Armenian, and Arabic, people coming from that part of the world, the collapsing Ottoman Empire. In the process of doing that work, I put the word out to various people that if you run across any of these old records in these languages, let me know, I want it. And now and then people would tip me off. And I was going to learn about some singer or other, and I was tipped off I should go talk to this guy in Silver Spring, Maryland, near where I live in Baltimore, named Leo Sarkeesian, who was then 93 years old or something. And Leo and I hung out a bunch of times, and he had some stories and experiences that were great. And then Leo was in the process of dispersing with all of the stuff he'd accumulated over an extraordinary career, worked for the Voice of America for decades, since the 60s, early 60s, hired by Edward R. Murrow. And he had grown up in Haverhill, Massachusetts. His parents were from Diyarbakir, and he grew up in a trilingual Turkish, Armenian, English-speaking household. So he's getting rid of all his paintings and instruments and all this stuff. And he said, would you like these records? And I said, yeah, I would. Because he knew I cared about the music. You know, I liked it. He said, all right. So he gives me all his 78s. It's all the records he bought in New York City in the 1940s and 50s, and all the records that his father and uncle bought in Massachusetts in the 19-teens and 20s. And I just packed them in the car, took them home, and began listening through them. One of them was a Columbia record with an orange label, which is unusual. It was broken, cracked, still played, and I put the needle on it, and it wasn't ouds or clarinet or violin or anything like that. It starts out and it's a string quartet, which is a bad sign immediately, because it's not what I want. I want truth. I want down-home folk truth, right? This is going to be some kind of middle-class aspiring values stuff. Malarkey. It's not what I'm interested in. But then this voice comes out of the record. And I immediately thought, oh, well, okay, I like you. You can sing, for one thing. Classical, but good. Okay. And then she does a thing, you'll hear it, and it stopped me dead, riveted me. And I said, okay, I've never heard anything like that in my entire life. I put the needle back in the beginning of the record, and it did it again. And I said, okay, now I have to find out who you are. So what do? This is 15 years ago. I Googled her, and there's nothing. Okay, that's not that uncommon. But then, I decided I was going to include it in a compilation project I was working on at the time, and I found a couple of sentences of information I could say about her. I knew that she was born in 1891, and I knew that she, at the time of the recording, had a daughter who was about 11 years old, and that the record was made in 1917. And the song was called Grunk, and and that's a song that lots of people sing, and that's all I knew for years and years. And then we started having conversations about her. I met a guy in Detroit named Arakelian, who was really interested in this thing I was doing with these old Armenian records. It's where he's from. And what's this guy doing over here with this Polish last name? Why is he? Oh yeah, well I should be also. And so he and I got to be close in touch. And then Harout shows up, and the three of us start like really trying to one-up each other. I found this thing, and you found that thing, and now we know this, and then does that mean then that these things are connected? And we're putting this puzzle together collaboratively. And it took all this time, since I put the needle on the record in 2010, until 2022, that we finally found out who this person was who made that record that stopped me in my tracks. So, finally I'm going to tell you who that person is, as briefly as I can. She was not born with the name Zabelle Panosian. She was born with the name Takoi Dermazrobian in 1891 in a place called Bardizag, which is about 80 miles due east of Constantinople, Istanbul. It was a town of 10,000 people about the time she was born. It was entirely Armenian speaking, 90-something%. They did this hundreds of years. Armenians lived autonomously in this village through a combination of discretion and bribery. They would have some Turkish official into the village once a year or something, feed him a nice meal, give him a couple of drinks, and then hand him an envelope and say, now, what we think is that wouldn't it be good if you told our Turkish neighbors what a benefit it would be for their eternal souls not to be among us non-believers? Wouldn't that be in the best interest of everybody? And he would say, yes, absolutely, that's the right thing. And they got left alone for a couple of hundred years. Right up by the Bay of Izmit, of the Sea of Marmara. Town had a main road, 2 churches, elementary school, on both sides of the town, silk spinning mills, and surrounded by mulberry groves where the silkworms fed, right? So that's how they operated. She's born there, goes to the school, elementary school, she teaches kindergarten a little bit, she sings in the church, and then when she's 8 years old, the first bad thing happens. Her mother dies. We don't know why. Then when she's 11, the second bad thing happens. Turkish military men come into her house in the middle of the night and take this 11-year-old girl from bed, ride her off on a horse, and make her sing and dance on tabletop for them. She said twice. Twice she told that story, years later. She was apparently returned home, we hope unharmed. Then, 15 years old, the third bad thing happens. They try to abduct her again. And her father and a couple of family friends step in and save her. But they realize this is not safe for her. She can't be here. This is a problem. And they send her away. 1907. She goes first to Egypt, Armenians, because of the revolutionary activity, were not allowed to have passports to go outside of the Ottoman Empire, so she just had an internal passport, we think. So she goes to Egypt, and somebody there, family friend, we don't know, gets her passage to the United States, Boston, where she is married to a man to protect her at 15 years old, a guy from her village, Armenian Panosian. He's about 10, 15 years older than her, and was doing fine. Right about that time, right about 1908, he goes to work for the Tickner Brothers Postcard Company, significant developers of the picture postcard in America, mass media communication form. He does very well at that. The month after she turns 18, they have a daughter, Adrina. They live in Somerville, Massachusetts, in a house with another Armenian family. And then her husband is very supportive of her. Harout just found out in the past couple of months, they advertised for somebody to come help around the house, a girl to come in. Because when you're 18 and a new immigrant and don't speak the language and you have an infant, it's hard to get all this washing done and cooking and cleaning and stuff. Right, so you need some help. And they had enough money to hire somebody in. Anyway, so that's new information. But he also gets her English lessons, and he gets her singing lessons. First with a couple of guys named Hooker and Graham, with whom she says she learns practically nothing. And then with an older middle-aged woman named Gertrude Duena, who she says taught her the delicacies of the art of singing. Now, right about this time, right about 1910, America is going through opera mania. There are two big opera houses in New York City, a new one shows up in Chicago, and this guy Otto H. Kahn builds one in Boston. The Marx Brothers movie, Animal Crackers. There's a character, Roscoe W. Chandler, who's this pompous, deracinated, assimilated Jew who is a that's Otto H. Kahn. So he builds the Boston Opera Company. It only lasts 5 years. But during that 5 years, they have all the best singers in the world. Nellie Melba, Luisa Tetrazzini, Amelita Gallicurci, great singers. And Zabelle goes and sees this and says, yes, that's for me. And so she begins to develop her voice in that direction. She also begins to represent herself as being of the Boston Opera Company. Now, there's lots of documentation of those 5 years of the Boston Opera Company, and she ain't in it. She never had a role. Maybe she got to put on a costume and be in the chorus. Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe she just liked it a lot. By 1912, she's singing in public. 1913, 1914, she's singing for other Armenians in the Boston community. By 1914, she's so popular that she has to take an ad out in the newspaper saying, please don't use my name if I'm not performing at your event. Because she was so popular, people would come to see her. So yeah, that's some measure, isn't it? Anyway, so 1915, more bad things happen, as we know. Okay, so the way it went down in Bardizag is that, of course, March 1915, Constantinople, Istanbul, several dozen men are arrested, taken off. Leaders of the community, some of them musicians, some of them dentists, some of them priests. They're taken off into prison by the government. And then all of the guns are taken away in Bardizag, and the government conscripts all of the men to work, the young men to work in military jobs, building roads and things, and then they come around and they take the leaders of the community, the men, come with us, and they take them off and they beat them, physically. So everybody knows there's violence on the table. It's not like in Indonesia in the 60s, where they take you off and they pour soapy water down you until you vomit and vomit, but there's no sign that you've been tortured. No, this is just violence is on the table. And then they go around to everybody and they say, you're selling everything. Now, all your rugs, all your furniture, everything, it all comes out onto the street immediately, because you're going to, and we're going to invite in all the neighboring villagers, and they're all going to come and pay whatever they want, a pittance for everything you have, because you're going to need that money to pay to us, the government, for your removal. You're paying us for your train ride out of here, because you're leaving. One train to another train to another train to another train to the edge of Syria, and then march down to the desert. And this apparently, Zabelle finds out a couple of years later, is how her father dies of starvation. Three of her siblings make it out. They join the family in Boston. Aram, her husband, gets them jobs in the postcard company, and they do other things. But news comes in. Everybody knows what's going on. And Zabelle is a performing artist, and she begins devoting herself completely to fundraising activities. She performs relentlessly for years, raising money, doing all kinds of other benefits too. I mean, you know, there's the political activity and the work that men are doing, and then women kind of have this parallel track of activism and fundraising that's going on, and she's involved in all of that. But primarily as a performer. Okay, now, parallel to this, she meets another singer who makes it over December 1914. So right before 1915, this other guy shows up in the United States that she meets. Good singer, Armenag Shah-Mouradian. How many people know Armenag Shah-Mouradian, by the way? May I ask? It's interesting to know. Some people
personally
We know of
yeah,
him.
have heard his voice, know the name. A handful. Okay, that's interesting. So there.
Some records.
Yes.
me too.
Yeah, he was he's the most significant voice.
I think he was a student of Gomidas.
Precisely, yes. He was from Mush, a town about 5 times the size of Bardizag, 50,000, 60,000 people, about 50 Christian and Muslim, and he's about 10, 15 years older than Zabelle was. He goes to Georgia, studies with Gomitas. Gomitas Vadarpet, the great patriarch of Armenian music at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, wonderful composer, ethnomusicologist, published a lot of his own work, a lot of folk songs, studied in Germany, the significant figure of Armenian music at the time. Shah-Mouradian had studied under. Then, Shah-Mouradian was in Georgia and was involved in all this revolutionary activity and gets arrested, twice. Second time, he's led out by a beneficent Turkish military officer who says, go back to your town, you young musician, you're talented and you're harmless, you just teach your choir and you'll be fine. So he does. 3 years in poverty, teaching a church choir, fine. He makes it out, goes to Paris. In Paris, he studies under Pauline Viardot. Is not a name that was known for a long time. She was then 90-something years old. Her family musical lineage goes back to Mozart. She's now being reconsidered as a significant composer at the time, and was an Armenophile, had already at that time composed a 4-handed Armenian dance suite there in Paris. And he studies under Vincent Donghi at the Scola Cantorum. Anyway, so he studies with Gomitas, goes to Paris, studies there, gets the lead role in Gounod's Faust at the Paris Grand Opera, and goes from being this poor artist to being a big star overnight. Tours all over Europe. Famous guy, rich. Part of the tour, he goes, beginning of 1914, back to Constantinople, Istanbul, meets back up with Gomitas, and they make a bunch of records. So now I'm finally going to play you a record. This is Shah-Mouradian, accompanied by Gomitas Vadarpet, in 1914, Constantinople, Istanbul, playing this song, Grunk, Crane. Crane, Grunk, was at that time 300 years old, certainly. Now 400 years old, right? Earliest known text, according to our collaborator Arakelian, found in Aleppo, Syria. Identical words. They're in this kind of formal old Armenian, but roughly they go, Crane, where are you coming from? I am servant of your voice. Have you any news from home? Hasten not to your flock, you will arrive soon enough. In this 1919 edition of Songs of Armenia, it's titled Pilgrim Song to the Crane. So it's somebody who's away from home asking this bird from up north in historical Armenia, what's going on back home? I miss it, I want to go back. That's what the song is, basically. So here they are performing it, 1914. I'm only going to play about a minute and a half of it, and I'll apologize in advance for the sound of this rented guitar amp from Guitar Center. That's Shah-Mouradian singing with Gomitas.
Oh
that melody. See if you can remember that melody or how it sounds, okay? So, Shah-Mouradian in 1914 is in Constantinople, Istanbul, can't go back to Paris because World War I breaks out. So he, his wife, and his daughter, December 1914, come to the United States. And they meet this young singer who's got a little bit of a reputation. She's what, 24, something like that? And they start doing benefit concerts together. And they're his concerts and she's the opening act. Detroit, Toronto, Syracuse, bunch of places. And they're raising money, sending it over, various charities. During this period, America's involved in the Near East Relief Campaign, the first large-scale philanthropic effort for a foreign, we'll say, population. Several things about the Near East Relief Campaign had an important impact on Zabelle's career. She raised huge amounts of money to send back home for various causes. But the Near East Relief Campaign drilled into the minds of every American that the word Armenian is always preceded by the word starving. Friends of mine in Baltimore grew up in the 1950s, was told as a kid, eat your vegetables, don't you know they're starving Armenians? I grew up in the 80s, it was Ethiopians. But it's this reduction of a whole people to their suffering, right? This image grows in people's minds. Oh, we have to give and give and give for the starving Armenian. And this whole period, 1915, 16, 17, 18, 19, which is Zabelle's great flowering as an artist in the United States, is entirely wrapped up in that cultural moment. So, as World War I is going on, the two of them are performing together, Shah-Mouradian and Panosian, they're performing separately. And in front of big audiences, in front of very significant people, General Electronic and Calvin Coolidge and all these people. She gets up and sings the Star-Spangled Banner and is very patriotic toward America and our efforts in the war. And she decides that she needs to make records. So she goes to Victor Records in Camden, New Jersey. There are two major record companies in the United States before the Second World War, Victor and Columbia. And they both, in about 1908, get the idea in their heads that they need to start recording music for all of these immigrants that are coming. 1880 to 1920, largest wave of immigration that the United States ever saw. Peak year, 1907. Zabelle arrives, 1908. 1,000 people a day just through Ellis Island for decades. That doesn't include all the other ports. Tons of the number of foreign-born people in the United States between 1880 and 1920, always between 13 and 14%. The number of foreign-born people in the United States right now, very nearly 14%. We'll come back to that. All these immigrants, the record companies see, and they go, can we get some money out of these people? 1908, the same year they introduced the double-sided disc, they also decide, we're going to try selling music in foreign languages to the immigrants. And they start with the largest per capita groups. Germans, Italians, down the line. And eventually, by about 1910, 11, 12, they're getting around to Turkish-speaking people, Armenian-speaking people, Greek-speaking people, Arabic-speaking people, 10 to 16, right in that era, right as World War I is starting. Zabelle goes to the more prestigious of the two labels, Victor Records, Camden, and she does a trial record where she sings Grunk, which is a song that she sings at every concert, and they turn her down. And then Shah-Mouradian goes to Victor, and he sings for them, and they turn him down. So what does she do? She goes to New York City to the Woolworth Building, the tallest building in the world at the time, 60 stories, with elevators that ran on coal 6 days a week, guys in the basement shoveling coal to run the elevators, goes up to the 7th floor to the studio of Columbia Records. And March 1917, records 6 songs, handful of sides. The first of them is Grunk. The other side is Im Soreli Zavagmus, My Beloved Children. Bunch of stuff. And they're good. And Grunk, when they release it at the end of 1917, is a runaway hit. Huge seller. Anybody who was buying records who spoke Armenian bought a copy, basically. And it stayed in print continuously from the end of 1917 until 1931, when Columbia Records finally deleted its entire Armenian language catalog. Now, in 1920, Columbia Records, the home of Miles Davis, Bob Dylan, big record company, right, still going. In 1920, for every 5 records they were releasing, 3 of them were in languages other than English. The marketing campaign toward immigrants was enormous. They didn't get around to, nobody in America got around to recording the voice of a black woman until March 1920. But already we had stars singing in Armenian, Arabic, Greek, people selling tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of copies. Grunk was an enormous runaway hit. Funny thing is, she goes into the studio for these dates with sheet music, expresses to the musicians what to play, and then gets them to do it over and over and over again. She recorded Grunk a total of 8 times. Columbia's policy at the time, 2 takes, master and a backup. That's it for everyone. Immigrants, everybody. Master and a backup. And they had not yet invented the idea of a best take. So what winds up happening with Grunk, when you see a copy, if you ever do, when you put the needle down on it, you're not going to know which one you're getting, which take you're getting, until you hear it. So, anyway.
Excuse me, wasn't that on the runoff groove though?
No,
Next to the label, they didn't print that at all?
no. They look identical. It was printed on 3 different labels to get into some pedantic record stuff. The first one is orange, the one I saw. I believe, I'm not sure, 12 records were released on the orange label, all by foreign singers who were highly trained, and they are all in benefit of World War I released efforts. And then, when that effort stops, the end of World War I, they repress it on the pale green label with the gold printing, and then they reissue it again in 26 with a dark green label where the disc is laminated. Now, from 1920 onward, it's always take 7. But between the end of 17 and 20, it's either takes 1, 2, 5, or 7. And the only way to tell is either drop the needle on it, or there's an emboss under the label that you can kind of see that code may include, or may not, the take number. So, sorry, record stuff. This is what you have to do doing this. So, our book that we published about Zabelle includes a CD with every note she is known to have sung. And in order to do that, it took all this boring, pedantic stuff. But anyway, so she makes this record Grunk, huge runaway hit, and now I'm just going to play it for you, the whole thing, all the way through, because it is one of the greatest records ever made. Why was it a runaway hit? Because it was exactly the situation in 1917 that all Armenians in the United States were in. What's going on back home? I want to go back, and there's no home to go back to. Everything you ever knew and everyone you ever knew is gone. In Bardizag, they destroyed the mulberry groves, tore down the churches, went into the homes, you had to turn in your keys on the way out, and ripped up the floorboards. From 10,000 people in the beginning of 1915 to the end of 1917, 36 people left. Everything is gone. This is a song that she worked on hard. And it is a completely different melody and mode from anyone else's version, because she said she learned it from the lips of her countrymen. It is a melody and mode specific to Zabelle Panosian from Bardizag. There is, we have the name, Arakelian found a guy of Zabelle's generation who transcribed a version of Grunk that is roughly the same melody. It's, I can't remember the Macan. Anyway, so I'm going to play it for you now. So she created from all of her experience, at 25 years old, the mother of an 11-year-old daughter, this thing that I fell in love with. records are good. There aren't other records like that. It's a very special thing in the world. It's been wonderful, gratifying to see her stand up and walk around again, to see her take on life and live among us again through this project and get to know her as a person. That record sold so well for so long that it became, for that generation, part of the, well, for instance, a guy named Harout, who was born in 1903, survivor of the genocide, wrote an essay called The Gardens in Our City in 1930 about a typical picnic in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx. And here's a memory of that includes Zabelle, where he says, gradually the smoke of barbecued lamb would saturate the atmosphere and mix with the other smoke of burning memories. At that point, joining this mixture would be the sonorous voice of Shah-Mouradian singing Hayastan, pouring out of the throat of a morning glory horn gramophone. And then you would hear grunk of Zabelle Panosian, and especially the Turkish language Anduni, it's like an immigrant song called Egen Havasi, springing forth with sad fluctuations from the depth of Kemeni Minas's soul. And still, to this day, when you find old Armenian records of peoples of that generation, these people who were buying records 1917, 1918, those are the three records that you always see. Shah-Mouradian singing Hayastan, Egen Havasi by Kemeni Minas, another one of the greatest vocal records ever made. Whole other story, great record, very different. He died immediately afterward, apparently had TB and had holes in his lungs while he was singing it. Other story. And Zabelle's Grunk. It meant a lot to people for a long time. But then, Zabelle continues all this work, this fundraising, the war ends. She sings at Camp Devens in Connecticut, right as the Spanish flu is breaking out. And a third of the soldiers get it, and she doesn't. And she does a benefit for them. Later, she does a benefit for Gomitas. Gomitas Vidarpet was one of the people arrested in 1915 in Constantinople, Istanbul. And on the train ride out to the prison, as the light of the moon is flickering through the trees in the train ride, he starts hallucinating and being pursued by dark forces, asks another priest in the car to say a prayer for him. But from that point forward, he is troubled by what we would now call post-traumatic stress syndrome, basically. Depression and trauma. And from that point on, he goes first to Constantinople, Istanbul, to a psychiatric facility, and then finally to Paris, to a psychiatric facility where he lives the rest of his life. She sings a benefit for him, the poor, depressed priest that she loves. And she does benefits for the orphans who are coming out of the desert, of particularly those from Bardizag, but also anyone, and takes this on as her project. And she gets some recognition for it. 1919 is her peak year, really. A feminist journal, Armenian feminist journal called Haiguin in Constantinople, Istanbul, runs a big feature article on her with her photo. The Musical Courier, which is the establishment voice of Western classical music in New York City, runs a big feature on her. All of her charity work is talked about, but also she can sing. This little Armenian girl can sing. She gets a part. She gets an actual role. She doesn't just have to be waving a flag and singing sad songs at charity anymore. She gets up and she sings in Boston at this biblical pageant play with 300 backup singers and 500 dancers, where she plays the role of Abishag from the Book of Kings. And then, early 1920, she doesn't stay and keep working on building her career in the US. She gets a passport for her and her daughter to go to Europe. And she decides that she's looking for some maybe family members, but she's gonna go do some music stuff. The passport's for 3 months. She stays for 3.5 years. First stop's England. She plays in Manchester at like a ladies' tea, and then sets up at the Hotel Vernet near the Champs-Élysées. Nice place. I went. Michelin star restaurant. Nice place. 3 years they're set up there. Her and her daughter, and she takes lessons with a very good singing teacher who's taught Nellie Melba and all these other serious stars. She goes to northern Egypt, to Alexandria and Cairo. But the first thing she does in Paris, she goes and finds Gomitas in the mental hospital. And they tell her not to go, because last week he threw his shoes at somebody. And she goes. She brings 2 doctors with her, men. They are careful not to tell him that they're doctors because he hates doctors. And she publishes an account. It is the only first-person account of her life in her own voice, and it shows her as a musician, as a researcher, as somebody who's serious about their work, going to the source, to pay homage, and to learn. So they find him in the courtyard of the psychiatric facility, and he's like walking around the hedges talking to himself. And they sort of hesitantly walk forward, and he looks up and he says, my daughter, you remind me of someone, one of my students. And she says, well, I am one of your students, but from far away, we've never met. Oh yeah, where from? Boston. Bostan? Turkish for vegetable garden. Do they grow a lot of vegetables there? And it's very uncomfortable, and she doesn't know what to say. And finally she says, no, well, I came actually because I want to ask you a question about music. Oh yeah, sure, go ahead, anything. Well, I wanted to know the music that you composed for choir, is it okay to sing those solo voice? Of course, my daughter. Anything, if you know the song and you feel the song, sing it any way you like, it's yours to take. Take it. Well, thank you very much. I don't want to tire you out, she says. He says, fine, fine. Someday you come back and you sing for me and I'll sing for you. And she says, I'll do that. And then she says, someday I hope the Vidarpid will be cured and we will all sing together, Ganche Kurum Ganche. And then she doesn't go back. And she doesn't mention Shah-Mouradian, who they both know. What happened to that? Shah-Mouradian incidentally winds up going to Paris himself and dying in a psychiatric facility. She doesn't mention that she did a benefit concert for Komitas. She doesn't say that she's from Bardizag, where he had been. She's nervous. She gets out of there fast. But she does a lot of shows. Big theaters, renting out these 1,000-seater halls, as she had been doing in New York and filling them, and Boston, the Garrick Theater in Boston. And then she goes to Egypt, does some shows there, and then to Milan. Milan, she starts singing in Barber of Seville, La Scala. Big cheers from the audience, long live Armenia, in the middle of the performance. She's a star. These glowing reviews come back to Egypt and are printed. Our girl Zabelle is doing great in Milan, right? All right, she goes back to Paris, fills another hall. Then, 1924, she comes back to the United States. I know I'm running out of time. 1924, she comes back to the US. Aram has moved the family from Boston to New York City and set them up there, and she joins in. Her 2 brothers are there. They're both tailors. Neither of them have children. Her daughter has, her sister has children, which are the only living descendants because Zabelle's daughter never had any children of her own. Yes, we were in touch with Zabelle's great-grandnephew, who contributed 2 photos to the book. Karajan Varojan Karas. I'm going fast. Anyway, and she starts to relaunch her career. She rents out a couple like big halls and she starts showing off. She's a better singer now than she was before, right? The end of her time in Italy, she began using her husband's first name as her surname, Zabelle Aram. And for a couple of shows in New York, in the Armenian press, she uses both names. Zabelle Aram, previously known as Zabelle Panosian, right? The artist formerly known as. And then she just drops the Panosian. And we don't really know why. But one of the reasons, maybe why, is this whole starving Armenian bit, right? Like, what a drag is a serious artist, a diva, who spent years on the road living backstage with artists in hotel rooms and cabs. Come back to America, and what's going on in America in 24 is the Johnson-Reed Act. Please raise your hand if you know what the Johnson-Reed Act is. It's always the same. Everywhere I go, one person knows. The Johnson-Reed Act, 1924, is the quota system for immigrants, where they set a number of how many immigrants could come to the United States for every country on earth. Where they got the numbers from was an 1890 census, preceding the big wave of immigration of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, where 1/3 of the immigrants were from Italy, 1/3 of them were from Eastern Europe, 1/3 of them were from elsewhere, but America was changing and becoming a lot more Catholic and a lot more brown eyes. There was a big hit song in 1920. I just gave Harout copy I found in Clovis recently. It was a Nora Bayes song. Nora Bayes sang over there, big World War I song, the Taylor Swift of her time. She also had a big hit song with the Argentines, the Portuguese, and the Greeks. There's the Argentines and the Portuguese, the Armenians and the Greeks. They don't know the language, they don't know the law, yet they vote in the country of the free. Now the funny thing, when we start to sing, my country 'tis of thee, none of us know the words but the Argentines and the Portuguese and the Greeks. America's going through a period of massive xenophobia and deep anxiety about all these immigrants coming in. It's a song about that. There's this deep ambivalence. Experts convinced the citizens of the United States that people who are from Southern and Eastern Europe were vastly more inclined to criminality and feeble-mindedness. And what we needed to do was reset America the shade of white it was before all these people came. And so we passed the Johnson-Reed Act, where after that, there's 120 Armenians a year were allowed in the United States. That's it. 100 Greeks, 100 Albanians, 100 Palestinians, 100 Syrians. How many from Asia or Africa? Zero. Zero. Until the law was overturned in 1965. Right? So if you were born in the 1940s, like my father, like the president, and the previous president, you look at America, when it opens up in 1965 through the 70s, 80s, more and more people come from South and Central America, from Africa, from Asia, and you go, this is not the America that I grew up in. And you're right, because the America you grew up in was the most monocultural, monolingual America there ever was for 20 years. Anyway, she comes back to that, right? It's a period where people are looking at Armenians and going, oh, you ain't from here. So, she's Zabelle Aram. She gets up on stage and does all these concerts where she does a quarter of the show in Italian, a quarter in French, a quarter in English, and then the Armenian songs are at the end. She does costume changes for each of them to demonstrate that this is international art that she is presenting. The quality of the shows just drops and drops and drops. I mean, the other acts on the bill, comedian dancers, dog acts, like vaudeville stuff. She goes and plays for some rich people, she does various things. She comes on tour here, which Harout will address in 1926, about the time we think her voice was at its best. Sorry, one thing. I just want to address this point of, was her voice any good in a broad sense? She recorded 11 songs, one song in French, everything else in Armenian. The song she recorded in French was from a minor opera called Pearl of Brazil by Lucien David, a song called Charmant Oiseau. Charmant Oiseau had been previously recorded by a number of people. It's this very fancy coloratura fireworks piece, right? So I'm going to play you just 1 minute, the last minute, of Charmant Oiseau as recorded by her contemporary, Emily Gallicurci, who's from Milanese nobility, the best singer, just amazing. She was exactly the same age as Zabelle, recorded it 6 or 8 months earlier. Huge hit. This is Emily Gallicurci singing Charmant Oiseau. Nope, it's not. This is. Just to give you a sense, this is the art that's going on, that's the high art. Opera singers at the time were what Hollywood stars became in the 30s and 40s. That's glamour. Zabelle, the same last minute of the same song. 6 months later, 1918, June 1918. Arakelian? No, nobody is. Come on. She's very good, and that's 1918. So we have here a review from 1919 by a guy who says, just because you're popular doesn't mean you're good. While Zabelle Panosian's vocal tone is beautiful, it is as uncultivated as a flower in an untouched forest. Nature gave her the gift which needs to be cultivated to blossom to its full beauty if she focuses on European songs. This is what I thought when I accompanied her on piano 3 years ago. 1916, this reviewer played piano with her and thinks like, eh. So I went to the concert February 9th, 1919. Up until now, Zabelle was known for Armenian songs, which she sang in true Armenian style, which, by the way, Prof. Galafian says is the opposite. He says it's too Turkish. Whole other story. The writer then focused on her English, and the reaction to her performance of Meyerbeer's Shadow Song was overwhelming. People applauded it more than the Armenian songs because she was able to display her vocal talents more. Her voice competed with the flute. Her technique was great. At one point, her voice and the flute were so harmonious, one thought it was two flutes. She produced these notes with clarity and ease. It is obvious she's better trained than 3 years ago. For her performance of Armenian songs, to her compliment, she didn't alter them, but instead showed better grip. Nat Sashun, which she notably never recorded, was the best received. It's fair to say that she is the best Armenian female voice. In her singing style, one can hear Oriental warmth and color. She strongly speaks to Armenians and awakens memories of home. And she just got better. From 1919 to 1926, the year this thing's invented, by the way, she never recorded on a microphone. She never recorded again. Her reputation just kind of slides off into nothing. 1932, there's an event where they have a soprano get up and sing, and she's not invited. What happens in 1932, by the way, for her? She turns 41. You know, the joke in Veep where Julia Louise-Dreyfus says, "My career is over the day I can no longer wear short-sleeve dresses." It's a thing that we have where when you've got a young, cute girl who's a performer on stage, and everybody likes her and likes looking at her and projecting whatever on her, then she gets to be middle-aged, and then people stop being interested and she doesn't get the roles anymore. Is that what's going on? I don't know. She continues to be a part of the community. She plays at literary events and things. By 1972, the Armenian-American singer Kathy Barbarian, everybody know Kathy Barbarian, big classical avant-garde singer in the 1950s and 60s, married to Luciano Berio, etc. She was interviewed by Charles Arakelian. She says, you know, once, 1972, once, there was an Armenian girl who was a big star, but nobody knows what happened to her. She just kind of fell away, disintegrated into nothing. Zabelle was alive and well in New York City in 1972. She lived until 1986. In 1982, she gave the Armenian General Benevolent Union $756,939, the equivalent of about $2 million now. By that point, she was living in an apartment on 183rd Street that her daughter had rented out. We haven't gotten to her daughter's career, which from 1934 to 1975 is its own amazing story. She changed her name, represented herself as Spanish her entire career. It's a whole other thing. Zabelle gives them $2 million, basically is what that amounts to now. And in response, they gave her a short obituary which ran, Zabelle Panosian, the extremely well-known, beloved singer of the Armenian-American old generation, closed her eyes forever, leaving behind her good name and her remembrance-worthy work. Peace be to her tormented soul. I've spoken too much. It's time for Harout to tell you some more of the story. Thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate it. Shall I get this out of your way?
No, it's fine.
Oh, you like it? Okay.
Yeah.
Are you gonna take questions?
Haven't done yet.
Yes, definitely. Harout, you're going to talk for about 10 minutes, 15
About
minutes?
10 minutes.
Okay, 10. Just so that people know that we're not going to keep you here forever.
Yes.
It doesn't
I'll
bother
try
me.
and be short with it. thank you all for being here tonight.
Oh, I'm sorry, I turned it off. Yes.
Hello. Okay. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you to the Armenian Studies program at Fresno State. And we're very fortunate to be here and we're thankful to talk about Zabelle Panosian and the ongoing work the Fresno State is doing in preserving Armenian-American history and culture. So I'm just going to give a few minutes about the behind-the-scenes stuff of how we put the book together and things of that sort. So, over 100 years ago, Zabelle Panosian's voice was recorded and documented and captured on these discs that we've been discussing. And today her music has become, artifacts of time. But in 1917, her music was new, her art was new, and the medium was new, the phonograph was new. It was slowly becoming a household product. And if you were in the Fresno area, you probably purchased a phonograph from the Nishkian store. It was opened in 1898 by Kalim Hagop Nishkian, first bicycle shop that was later converted to a phonograph shop. And the family ran it quite successfully until the 1930s. So the story of the Armenian contribution to the record industry in America starts in 1909 with this gentleman, Martyros Dersak-Kistasyan. He came to America in 1892 at age 12, and by 1918, he would relocate to the Central Valley, purchasing a farm in Cutler bordering Yetem. But before he and his family moved to the West Coast, he and his brother Levon were selling Zabelle's records. You see both their names at the bottom portion of that image right there, Martyros and Levon Tashjan. They were selling the records of Zabelle and her contemporary Armenag Shah-Mouradian. While our book was a production of shared research, I was tasked with the photographic research. But what's presented in the book is a mixture of information that was found in newspapers and a wide variety of publications. Armenian-American, the international press. Her singing attracted attention from Fresno to Istanbul, from Paris to Cairo, and back to New York. And we also included a number of images from Ian's outreach, particularly with personal photos of Adrina's entertainment career. To get to know Zabelle more, we turned to genealogical resources, and we were able to get a better look into her life. Over 50 photos were included in the book, which were published in an assortment of these publications. Ian mentioned one of them, Haygin from Istanbul, Gavroche from Paris, Gurung and Horizon from Philadelphia, Sean Natalie's Phoenix Literary Journal. And this is where our co-author, Harry Kazalian, really helped out. And so a great vital resource that we used was the National Library of Armenia, where we were able to download a large amount of publications. And we would sift through it, scour through it as best as we could, and we sent Harry the Armenian text or clippings from the newspapers, and together we really saw her life the information coming out. Ian discussed Zabelle's visit to Gomidas Vartavet, and it was originally published in a Verazunun publication that we were able to reproduce. And it was Harry's translation that really brings it together.
That's part of the book.
Yeah.
Bless you, Harry.
I was going to read that excerpt, but I'm just going to kind of go right through it.
Is that actually in the book?
Yes.
The whole thing.
Yes. The
whole
whole
text.
article is in there.
Harry, this is like seeing the Jimi Hendrix Experience with only 2 members of the band.
So we gathered information from any source that we really could. Columbia Records even published a few catalogs with Zabelle's image and her likeness, and even a brief paragraph about her. One of them was published in 1920, and then I think the last one in 1930. While Columbia's documentation now is near non-existent, we relied on Richard K. Spotswood's ethnic music on records for discographical information. And then after that, we kind of pieced it together by realizing there were different takes for each disc. But to be specific to California, to bring Zabelle to California, this article is dated 1916, and it's the first article that we came across of Zabelle's name in Californian press, Armenian press. It's in the Ospadas newspaper. But there was an earlier connection that happened a few years prior, and I brought a physical one here. Zabelle's husband, Armenian Panosian, was quite successful in the postcard industry with the Tickner brothers. While he produced some early photo postcards related to flight, he also worked on a series of postcards for California. Both of these have a copyright to 1912, but we don't know if Adam actually traveled to California for the production of the postcards. Another story that Ian kind of alluded to, it starts in chapter 6 of the book, and it's a review of a concert by Zabelle Panosian and Armenag Shah-Mouradian that was held in 1917 in New York City. The review was quite critical, and we've republished it in the book. The author was quite harsh, and it was written by composer and music director Krikot Profkafayan. A few months prior to his critical review, it's interesting because Zabelle did perform with Profkafayan at a concert in 1916. By the early 1920s, Kafayan had settled in the Fresno area and worked as a music director for the Holy Trinity Armenian Church and other Armenian churches in the Central Valley. Prof. Kafayan was a contemporary of Gomidas's and, like Shah-Mouradian in France, studied with Vincent d'Indy. He even published an early Armenian-French language music journal, Gurung, and his published music was performed a great deal. He was also one of the first Armenians to establish a recording label in California. In 1925, he takes out a full page, writes a half-page article in Ospares where he informs the audience that in 2 years, I'm going to produce a set of records. And he does. He doesn't disappoint. By Christmas 27, his records are on the market. I asked Barlow if we could have some of his original sheet music here today. Maybe you could look at it a little later. What interactions he had with Zabelle after that concert that they had together, we don't know. And bring Zabelle to California. Her first and possibly only tour of California began in December of 1926, and it didn't go smoothly. First, we notice on December 8th, 1926, published in the Fresno Morning Republic, about her concert that's going to be held on December 12th at Fresno High School. This announcement, quite lengthy, was written by Dr. H.S. Jalalian. He wrote of his long friendship, and I believe he was an important figure in the history of Fresno Armenians. Another item a few days later, on December 11th, informs us of the program she's going to present and who's going to accompany her. Daniel Popovich, a Fresno area concert pianist, and 2 local young Armenian musicians. Richard Sadafyan, a flutist who would be a member of the Fresno Philharmonic through the 1930s, and Adam Devsadkarian. Born in Providence in 1903, he became a violinist and a longtime music teacher in the Fresno area. In their program, they had 6 works by Armenian composers. None of them were by Prof. Kafayan. I just think they didn't get along. The concert went well. It was a very nice review. And then Zabelle went to San Francisco to perform on December 19th. It's believed that she was going to go to Los Angeles over the holiday season to perform in LA, but she was going to make a stop in Fresno. And on December 21st, Zabelle was in a car accident in Merced. The report said that she was a passenger in a car that was overturned when the car hit a muddy patch. She suffered from broken ribs, bruises, abrasions, and severe shock. We don't know if the incident had any long-term effects or if it affected her career, but Zabelle was back on the stage after about a month of recovery. On January 23rd, 1927, she performs at a benefit concert in Reedley, and this time she's accompanied by another Armenian violinist, Zaven Hagopian. By November of that year, Zabelle would be back in New York performing in a production of The Barber of Seville. Well, that was a lot quicker than 10 minutes.
Was it?
Yeah, I think it was.
Is that it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
So I hope in highlighting this little brief interlude of Zabelle's life in America, it shows that we were quite thorough and diligent in putting the book together, but it's still not conclusive. There's still a lot that, I'm excited, and I wonder what unknowns we're going to discover in the future. Her star was bright, and she was constant during her most active years, and her contributions to the landscape of art and culture is proven without a doubt that she's stood the test of time. It's always exciting and a great pleasure to discuss Zabelle and early Armenian-American music. Artistically, she and her contemporaries laid a foundation, and we're just here, just experiencing it now. That's my part.
Thank you, Ian and Harout, for this wonderful look at a long-lost Armenian singer, a very interesting singer. We will have an opportunity for some questions, but we would like it in the form of questions. If the students have